There are times in NFL history where a player seems to be placed in the perfect position at the perfect time in the perfect circumstances to win a championship and to fulfill their potential. A common example of this, and probably the greatest example of this, is Patrick Mahomes. He gets drafted to the perfect situation with the perfect coach that knows how to harness his skill set, and the result was a MVP and a Super Bowl within his first 2 years of being a full-time starter. But more often than not, there are times where a transcendent talent is drafted to the wrong team that either doesn't know how to harness his potential or how to harness his skill set, or is absolutely having his talent wasted due to having an incompetent coaching staff, an incompetent front office, a toxic team culture, or just truly horrendous teammates. In this video, we're going to be discussing multiple players who are clearly transcendent talents, but they're currently having their talent wasted on very bad teams. Now, these could be teams that used to be contenders, and these could be teams that still have hope down the future, but for the time being, it looks like these teams are absolutely hopeless. Now, before we get started with the content, guys, please take a moment to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on my notifications. You don't even have to subscribe and turn on my notifications, but just leaving a like would really help this channel grow and would make all the time spent on this content absolutely worth it for me. On top of that, I live stream on Twitch on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays at 9 p.m. Pacific time. You can find a link to that in the description down below as well. Break! Mic check 1 2 1 2. At number 8, we have Leonard Fournette. Now, I know what some of you guys might be thinking. Mike, Leonard Fournette, he's not even that good. He's only capable of breaking out a pretty big run once in a while to just make his stats look good. Well, here's the thing. If you've been following Leonard Fournette since high school, you would understand that this guy was supposed to be the real deal. When he was drafted number 4 overall by the Jacksonville Jaguars, I couldn't help but feel, as a Dallas Cowboy fan, that if Leonard Fournette was drafted to the Cowboys and was put behind that incredible offensive line, he would absolutely flourish. But that's not what ended up happening. The beginning of his career looked somewhat promising, but at the same time, it did not, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. In his very first season in the league, he had over 1,000 yards rushing, but the problem was he averaged 3.9 yards per carry. And the Jaguars just kept feeding him because, well, they had a very good defense and they kind of needed Leonard Fournette to establish the run. On top of that, defenses tended to key in on Leonard Fournette because they knew the Jags were not going to be depending on Blake Bortles airing the ball out deep. So it made the Jaguars offense kind of predictable, so I guess that was always working against him. In his second year, he only played 8 games and he averaged 3.3 yards per carry. And then in his third year, this past season, he looked a lot better in my opinion. He played 15 games, had over 1,000 yards rushing, and averaged 4.3 yards per carry. Despite that, the Jacksonville Jaguars are still looking to trade him, and I can't help but feel like he'll definitely benefit from a change of scenery. I'm just thinking, oh my goodness, if the Philadelphia Eagles get their hands on Leonard Fournette, this is going to be a problem. I just can't help but feel like if he had a great play caller or an offensive-minded head coach that just knew how to game plan around him, he would absolutely succeed. But maybe I'm wrong. Jags fans, let me know how you feel, and LSU fans, please let me know in the comment section down below as well how you feel about this pick. Because up next, we have a player that is clearly having his talent wasted, and I don't know how many years he's got left. And we're talking about Julio Jones, a guy that has been a 1,000 plus yard receiver for the past 6 seasons. This guy is a matchup nightmare, and as a result of having such a poor team around him, he has been forgotten as the top wide receiver in the league. Most people like to pick Mike Thomas over Julio Jones, and honestly, the only thing I think that Mike Thomas has over Julio Jones is 1, target share, and 2, the fact that the Saints make it to the NFC playoffs every year. Julio Jones has still been as dominant as ever, posting 1,394 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns this past season, averaging 14 yards per reception this past season as well. But unfortunately, his team has not been the same ever since Tom Brady absolutely shattered them in the Super Bowl by coming back from a 28-3 lead. Now look, you could blame a bunch of other stuff. For example, the run game in Atlanta hasn't been as consistent as it once was. The defense in Atlanta definitely got a little bit worse as well, and they lost one of the greatest offensive minds in the last decade in Kyle Shanahan. And look, as soon as Kyle Shanahan left the Falcons and went to the 49ers, he was able to make it back to the Super Bowl within a few years. So the problem with Julio Jones isn't really himself. I don't even think it's his quarterback. I think it's the fact that the Falcons have been struggling in finding the proper offensive scheme to capitalize upon Matt Ryan's brilliance and Julio Jones's dominance. Hopefully they're going to be able to find the man for the job soon, but if not, it might be time for a brand new regime in Atlanta, because after all, Julio Jones is still only 30 years old. The next player on this list, I think we all agree, we just feel absolutely horrible for, and that's Deshaun Watson. At the beginning of his career, I was getting really worried about him because he was looking like an absolute matchup nightmare in his rookie season before he tore his ACL after 6 games. And then in his second season, he was looking really good as well. Over 4,000 yards passing in his first full season, 26 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, completing 68% of his throws. But dude, he got sacked 62 times. That's just literally bringing Texans fans flashbacks of David Carr from 15 years ago. Now this past season, it was more of the same. He threw 26 touchdowns and 12 interceptions, and the Texans made a very lopsided trade for Laramie Tunsil, so he only got sacked 44 times. But this past offseason, they decided to trade DeAndre Hopkins, bring in Randall Cobb on an overpriced contract, and pretty much get the same exact player on the opposite side in Brandon Cooks and his overpriced contract. Of course, they have David Johnson, but a common NFL fan can't help but wonder, what on earth are the Houston Texans doing? The DeAndre Hopkins Deshaun Watson connection was a very, very potent one. They were making some very weird head-scratching moves by giving up so much for Laramie Tunsil, but they had the right idea in mind. They had to protect their quarterback. Now I'm not really sure what direction they're trending in, so maybe someone who's a Texans fan could let me know, but I really hope that things begin to get a little bit better. Deshaun Watson's 24 years old, and so far, the Texans have nothing to show for his brilliant seasons. At number 5, we have AJ Green, a player whose entire career seemed to have been wasted by the Cincinnati Bengals. You see, there's been times where the Bengals actually had a shot at making a deep playoff run, but due to poor quarterback play by Andy Dalton, they weren't able to materialize those playoff hopes. They usually did that on the back of very stout defenses that featured the likes of Vontaze Burfict, Geno Atkins, and Michael Johnson, but you see, those days are way behind them. The Cincinnati Bengals are now in an official rebuilding mode, and AJ Green made it known that he wants to play elsewhere. But the Cincinnati Bengals don't care about that. You see, when you have a brand new rookie quarterback coming in, you want to surround him with as much talent as you possibly can to build up his confidence as much as you could. So I don't blame AJ Green for wanting to leave, but at this point he's just being used as some sort of pawn to help Joe Burrow's development. Maybe Zach Taylor is going to be able to do something and surprise us all this season, but in terms of going based off of paper, the Cincinnati Bengals have absolutely nothing to show for AJ Green's Hall of Fame worthy career, in which he put up a 1,000-yard receiving season each and every year that he played at least 13 games. So, yeah, the man deserves absolutely better. I really wish they would have let him walk this past season, because now he's just 32 years old. So he's only got like 2 to 3 years left in the tank, and he's stuck in Cincinnati Bengal rebuilding purgatory. At number 4, we have the young and disgruntled Jamal Adams, a player that is seeming to not get along with New York Jets management. And I don't really blame him, because the Jets drafted him with the number 6 overall pick, and that was a pick made by Mike Mack, their old GM. But their new GM, Joe Douglas, probably doesn't think that it's worth paying a safety that much money. And that's his philosophy. But the fact of the matter remains, Jamal Adams is a very, very good player, and he's stuck on a team that doesn't believe he deserves the contract that he wants. So as a result, he's pretty much stuck in no-no land, a team that's still rebuilding since the moment he's been drafted, who is trending upward, but honestly, I'm not a huge believer in Adam Gase myself. But the good news for Jamal Adams is he is still a very young player, and his best years, in my opinion, unless barring some unforeseen injury, are still way ahead of him. But nonetheless, until then, the New York Jets are absolutely wasting his career. At number 3, I have Christian McCaffrey. And this is not to say that the Carolina Panthers are bad, it's to say that Christian McCaffrey has a very, very short shelf life given the amount of carries he gets and how much he's used on the offensive side of the ball. And if the Carolina Panthers don't act quickly by supporting Christian McCaffrey with a good defense, which by the way, they're going backwards with the recent retirement of Luke Kuechly, then all of his production could be for nothing. Now, of course, we have to understand that Christian McCaffrey is just 24 years old. If he's able to sustain his career maybe until the 29-year-old mark, and if Matt Rule and Teddy Bridgewater are the real deal, then there's a chance that this could change and he could begin to see his talents actually being used for good. But until then, it appears as if 3 years into his career, and the Carolina Panthers don't really have much to show for all of the great production Christian McCaffrey's been giving them. To give you an example, in 2018, he's averaged 5 yards per carry, 1,100 yards rushing with 7 touchdowns. That's not even counting how many yards he had receiving, which is 867 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns. This past season, he was able to average over 1,000 yards receiving and 1,387 yards rushing. You don't find a lot of seasons like that, so Carolina, you better do something about this great transcendent talent that you happen to encounter in the 2017 NFL Draft. At number 2, we have Saquon Barkley, and I think Saquon Barkley is very close to being number 1 because there's no player that is clearly a transcendent talent that is absolutely electrifying to watch, but is doing it for seemingly nothing. Every time I turn on the TV to watch Saquon Barkley, it's like, okay, he's a phenomenal player, but even he knows that he doesn't really have much to play for. And all he's doing is risking further injury and mileage upon his body. So it really sucks because the Giants are like on a different level of rebuilding. There are those teams that are rebuilding and you can expect them to win a couple of games like the Cincinnati Bengals, but the New York Giants are so deep in their rebuild that they don't really have phenomenal players across the board besides Saquon Barkley. They're waiting for Daniel Jones to fully develop. They don't really have a terrifying defense either. So Saquon's going to go into another season where the Giants are expected to suck. He's already on his second head coach, and bear in mind, during his rookie season, he was given a brand new head coach in Pat Shurmur. Pat Shurmur got fired. They brought in Joe Judge. So that's typically not a good sign. If you're firing a coach within 2 years, it's a clear indication that you have no idea what you're doing. Not to mention that the Giants traded Odell Beckham Jr. originally, and at least before there was some promise of an OBJ and Saquon Barkley duo, but now it's just Saquon Barkley all by himself on the Giants. Which brings us to number 1, Odell Beckham Jr. There is no player that's career has been more frustrating and tragic for me to watch than OBJ. Now, look, I understand some people think that he's overrated. Some people think he's a diva. Let me say this from a perspective of a guy that watched him when he was in the NFC East and he was a division rival. This player was absolutely terrifying, and he's one of those players that we are not going to truly appreciate until he retires. He's fun to bag on, he's fun to hate on, and he's fun to call a diva, but statistics are statistics and performance is performance, and so far Odell Beckham Jr. has proven to me that he is an absolutely transcendent talent. A guy that's 5'11" shouldn't have the range that OBJ does, shouldn't have the route running that he does, and shouldn't be able to make the catches that he does. All Odell Beckham Jr.'s ever needed in a single season was 12 games to be productive. And bear in mind, he's done this with fairly pedestrian quarterbacks. He's only had Eli Manning in the twilight of his career, and Baker Mayfield in a year where Baker Mayfield didn't have such a good year. Despite all of that, OBJ has still been able to put up 6,511 yards in his career to go with 48 touchdowns. He currently averages 14 yards per reception, and he's been doing it on teams that haven't even made it to the playoffs. And honestly, that crushes me because I could tell this guy really, really wants to win. And honestly, for the sake of all NFL fans, I hope he eventually puts himself in a position to win. Hopefully this is the year that Cleveland's finally able to turn it around, and hopefully they finally pick the right head coach for the job. But unfortunately for Cleveland, history is not on their side.